Okay, I'll go over the typical scene processing protocol. So arrival and control, first thing, protect the scene, move people out of the scene, tapes, cones, vehicles, use everything you can to separate things out. Next up, set perimeters. You've got investigative perimeter and then the press and public perimeter. That's for the big scenes. Smaller scenes might just use a single perimeter. Document who is present. With photos, you've got body-worn cameras now. You're going to document the other officers, the victims, witnesses, the curious public, anybody who's around. You're going to try to get photos of those just to make sure you recognize who's there and who's not. Gather the basic information. This would be for a smaller scene, for example, like a burglary, where you're actually doing some interviewing as well as processing the scene. You're going to ask the basic questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how. Some of those things might include what time did you leave, what time did you come back, what's missing. I could walk through a house and not recognize anything else that's wrong, but the homeowners are going to know what's missing, and so they'll be able to talk you through it. Make sure when you're walking them through the house that you don't have them touch anything or move anything. Just try to keep it as is. Strategize your efforts. Taking photos initially is critical. You're going to want to do that all the time. Take tons of photos. Digital photography is easy. You can store it. We've got our databases to keep our photos. So take lots of photos. What is your top evidence priority and what do we do first? So strategize that with maybe another CSI or another officer. First round of photography, keep everything in place as you found it. Want to get that done before things get changed. It's real important. You're going to go several rounds of photos as you process a crime scene. Keep everyone out of the photos as much as possible. Try to get some time alone in the place if you're processing, say, inside of a residence, so that you don't have people in the photographs. It just doesn't look as professional. Evidence search. Decide what is evidence. Trace evidence is first. We've talked about that because sometimes things can get moved or air can blow things away or little things. So you focus on the little stuff first. Look for areas where you might find latent fingerprints. So let me give you a good example of that. Say you're processing a vehicle. People will say, I want you to fingerprint the whole thing. Well, people don't touch the whole thing, say, when they're trying to break into a car, but they may touch the door handle, they may touch the window, they might try to force the window down, they might try, if it's a stolen car, they would touch the gear shift lever. Some of the surfaces are better for processing than others, but you want to look for latent fingerprints, and we'll get into that later about how to process those. Look for areas where you might swab for DNA. So that's a good one too, because sometimes you have to have such a great surface for a fingerprint, but you don't need to have such a great surface for DNA, and maybe touch DNA would be worthwhile, and you can swab that using just distilled water, and then you get it wet, get your swab wet, and then you rub the swab and you collect your DNA and send it off to the lab. That's always a good one. Mark location of evidence with number cards. That's something it's going to be important for photography and for later for evidence collection. Next up is a second round of photography, so it doesn't hurt to, as you're doing these things, to, like I said, take more photographs. Scene sketch. You may think this is redundant because of photographs, but actually what the scene sketch will do is it'll lay out the dimensions. So you may see things in a photograph, but it doesn't. A sketch will better say what the distances are. Now, today we have these 3D scanners that are tremendous, and they can do that for you. Not all departments have those, but we do, and they're tremendous. Establish the reference points, triangulate evidence precisely. So what that means is you're going to take distances from different angles so that you can accurately reproduce the scene if you have to, say, for a courtroom. Evidence collection, label containers or envelopes first. You're going to put almost everything in a paper envelope of some kind or a bag. The reason you use paper is so that it breathes and things don't rot or mold. Talk about cross-contamination issues, keep things separate. And then you take it all back to the station and write your report, add photographs to your database. So your report is a chronological written account. Detail what you did and how you did it. Describe but not wordy, be concise and direct, and do not add your opinion. That's really important. It's you want to just say what the facts are. This truly is just about the facts. Okay, next up we're going to be talking about medium crime scenes. So let's talk about that. First one here, there's a lot here to read. I'll let you do that. It's going to be in the notes here in Canvas. Starting with burglaries. Residential burglaries happen all the time. quite surprising. People think it's not so common, but it actually is, unfortunately. So when you show up on one of those scenes, first thing you're going to think about is safety. Has the residence been cleared? If the person who lives there already gone through and determined that nobody's there, then you can go ahead and start processing. Otherwise, you're going to want to call for some backup and have you and your partners go through and make sure that the house is empty, or the apartment, or wherever it is, storage unit, whatever it is empty and there's nobody in there. After that, you can start processing. But look at the doors, see if they've been kicked, if they've been pried. Looking at ways that seem obvious. Sometimes it's not so obvious, but you'll see. Look for windows with fingerprints on them. Sometimes people will try to push windows and they'll leave fingerprints. Look for latches that have been pried. Look for tool impressions. That's important because you can use casting material and get an imprint of the impression, and perhaps it's been used in other burglaries. Take your photos, make sure the photo has a scale, and what a scale is it's a measurement. So it's usually got an XY axis, and so it's going to have measurements on that, so you can use that. Dental stone is something that can be used to make an impression of tools. There's other things out there as well that can make it's like an impression, and then you can send that to the lab and see if this has ever been used anywhere else. Things that have been left behind. Oddly enough, burglars will sometimes leave things behind, or maybe they've gone to the residence next door, burglarized that place, and then they come over and they burglarize the next, and there'll be some things brought from one to the other. Check those things for fingerprints or for DNA. You know clearly that is evidence because it wasn't there before and now it's there. Items that are stolen. Easily pawned items, look for those types of things. Food and alcohol, cash, jewelry, prescription drugs, firearms, all that stuff is really, really common. It's generally stuff that'll fit in a backpack. I've been to burglaries before where people have really been cleaned out, the truck's backed up and they've just cleaned out the residence, but that's not as common as something that fits in a backpack. So that's the type of stuff you're looking for. Let's see here, known hiding places, unlocked bedroom window. That's all important as you're going through the house. Okay, trace evidence. Look for hairs, check the floors, carpets, bedding, fibers, but it's not necessarily conclusive, but if you find stuff that isn't supposed to be there, then that's really a good evidence. The lab, you can send it off to the Washington State Patrol, and the crime lab can look at these things and get an idea of where it might have come from. Okay, biological evidence, depending on what kind of crime it was, whether it's blood or semen, you can collect that in using a swab and send that off to the lab as well. That's important. Clothing and bedding, look for transfers. And what I mean by that is, was anything left behind, smear marks, anything like that. Collect known samples. If it's a major crime, you might be, say it's a homicide, you might be cutting out pieces of the carpet, just in the event that, so you can have a compare to what's known, what's not known. Pet hair, and then elimination prints from the residence. If you've come across some fingerprints and people will say, well, I don't think I've touched that, then you can collect their fingerprints and then determine what belongs to them and what belongs to someone else. So robberies. Okay, I got to tell you one thing here. Robberies and burglaries are not the same. So robberies are against people, burglaries are against residences or unoccupied places. So people will often say, I was robbed, and then when you go to talk to them, you find out it was actually a burglary, or maybe their bike was stolen, but they weren't anywhere near it. So real important to get those distinctions, get those things separate. Where did the suspect come from prior to contact with the victims? Don't expect witnesses to remember details. You'll have to ask specific questions. So oftentimes in robberies, people they're traumatized, and rightfully so. They may give incorrect information. One example I can think of is one of the Cruise and Coffees was robbed. This was, oh gosh, probably 10 years ago. It happens fairly often, but this one in particular, we were given a very specific vehicle description. And then once we got there, or on the way there, all the officers were looking for that car coming from different directions and seeing if it was there. When I got there as the crime scene investigator, I was looking at the video, and once I saw the video, I could see that wasn't the car description at all. And so this person had probably just based on a unclear recollection of the event, she was traumatized. She gave a completely wrong information. So sometimes it's not reliable. You do the best you can, you gather the information you can, but just know that witness information is not always reliable. Okay, where did he or she exit to when leaving? Oftentimes you'll see in stores where they have this the one way in, one way out, and they may have markings on the doors to get an idea of how tall the person was. Should be video as well. Are there chances of shoe impressions or tire impressions or fingerprints? So that isn't always the case on the impressions, but fingerprints are a good one. And if it comes right down to it, if things that they've touched, you may be able to swab for DNA. Important quotes, observations, or actions. Was something said worth quoting? So if they say it in a certain way, they may do it again and say it the same way. That might be their routine. So it's important to try to figure out just exactly what they said, how they said it. Was it a phrase? When the suspects say it's a bank and they hand over a note, did they use their right hand? Did they use their left hand? Perhaps did the person have an accent? Were they not from around here? So that's all important as well. Any marks, scars, or perhaps they used a name. All those things you're looking for. You try to get details. Sometimes that can get people to respond. Any kind of tattoos or something that'll make this person distinctive. Felony assaults. Let's look at this. Let's start with knives. So people will give a description, start asking some specific questions. So were there unique characteristics? What was the handle? What did it look like? What color was it? How long was the knife? Was the blade on both sides? Was there any specific designs? Firearms. People will often seem to know what type or they have a few brand names of firearms, but they can be quite incorrect. So try to get specifics. Color, size, was it a pistol, was it a rifle, was it a shotgun, all these types of things. And if you can get further description about the gun, that's important. If there were shots fired, where did the casings go? If it's a semi-automatic, the casings are going to come out. If it's a revolver, the casings are going to stay in. If there were clubs or a bat, is there anything, did it leave any impressions? Did they strike a wall? Anything that would leave a mark? Blood spatter. Okay, make sure you don't say splatter. That's kind of one of those things. Say it's called spatter. And so find out where the spatter is, and what that is blood that's been cast off, and say it's landed on a wall or a floor or furniture or something like that. And based on measurements, we can determine with using trigonometry. The only time I've ever enjoyed math is using these formulas to determine where it was located, and based on the length and the width of the spatter, you can then determine where in the room this occurred. It's really fascinating stuff. So based on all that, you're going to try to reconstruct the assault. So go listen to what the person has to say, and then go back and try to walk them through. And don't tell them what happened, but when you're asking your questions, you can kind of prompt them along to see, to try to get some memories of the event. And then once the person's gone and you're just processing the scene, look everywhere. Don't rule anything out. Look up, look down, look in the ceiling. Just look for anything that looks out of place. It can take a long time. That's what crime scene processing is all about. It's a slow process, but take your time doing it, and you'll be pleased with the results, because like I've told you before, it speaks, and the evidence speaks. You'll find out what's happened. Okay, that's a lot to take in this week. That kind of sets the foundation for the rest of the course. Once you understand the basics of crime scene, then we can build upon that. So for this week, a couple things. I want you to read chapter 6, and then also want you to do exercise number 1. It's all in Canvas, the explanations there. Again, reach out to me if you have any questions. It talks about when it's due and full description of anything. But if you have any questions, I don't mind at all. I'd rather you spent the time, a few minutes, getting a clarification than doing it incorrectly. And I'm happy to help. So feel free to reach out to me. Anyway, thanks so much. Have a wonderful week, and see you next week.